Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. How the ancient Greeks invented the first vending machine. You are standing in the cool marble shadow of an ancient Greek temple. The incense smoke lingers in the air, curling toward the painted ceiling like a whisper to the gods. Pilgrims shuffle across the sun-bleached stones. They've come from across the land, some barefoot, others cloaked in robes dyed purple or green, each clutching a coin in hand, a small, circular talisman of faith and transaction. They are here not just to pray, but to pay. And in one corner of the temple, amid the golden statues and echoing chants, sits something odd, a bronze contraption. At first glance, it looks like a simple box with a spout, but approach it and you'll notice something unusual. Drop in a coin and out pours a small ration of holy water. A miracle. No, a machine. The inventor you've never heard of. Heron of Alexandria, sometimes spelled hero, lived in the 1st century CE. While today he is barely a footnote in the history of science, his work quietly anticipated inventions that wouldn't reappear for another 1,500 years. He was a mathematician, an engineer, and perhaps most significantly, a tinkerer. While others wrote lofty philosophical treatises about the nature of the cosmos, Heron was building mechanisms that moved. Steam-powered gadgets, automatic doors, stage machinery, and more. But among his strangest and most revolutionary creations was a device he detailed in his treatise, Pneumatica. It was, in effect, the world's first vending machine. This early automaton operated using basic hydraulics and levers. When a worshiper inserted a coin into a slot, it would land on a small pan attached to a lever. The weight of the coin would tip the balance, opening a valve. A measured amount of holy water would flow out. Once the coin fell off, the valve would close. It was simple, it was elegant, it was utterly forgotten by the modern world for centuries. Why holy water? The context here is important. This was not a commercial transaction as we might think of it today. There were no candy bars or cans of soda to vend. This was sacred. Holy water was considered an essential part of temple rituals used for purification before prayers or sacrifices. By automating the distribution of such water, Heron's machine solved a very human problem: how to prevent people from taking too much. This wasn't just about engineering, it was about managing scarcity, fairness, and trust in a sacred space. The vending machine wasn't meant to replace a priest. It was meant to create a standardized experience in the chaos of temple foot traffic. Worshippers received the same quantity. The priest could focus on more spiritual matters. The temple avoided misuse of resources. A tiny metal coin dropped into a mechanical contraption became an act of divine order. How it worked. To understand the mechanism is to appreciate the genius of the mundane. Coin drop slot. The device had a simple slot at the top where a coin could be inserted. Lever arm with pan. The coin would fall onto a pan that was part of a delicate lever mechanism. Valve activation. The weight of the coin tipped the pan, pulling open a valve below a water reservoir. Water dispensed. As the valve opened, a small stream of water was released through a spout. Automatic shutoff. Once the coin tipped off the pan, the lever returned to its original position and the valve closed. No electricity, no springs, just balance, pressure, and gravity. It's an astonishing thing to consider that nearly 2,000 years before the modern vending machine revolutionized workplace snacking, a Greek engineer was thinking in the same direction. Not to delight, but to regulate. Historical sleepwalking, why was it forgotten? So why didn't the vending machine catch on? Why wasn't this the start of an ancient industrial revolution? Part of the answer lies in the fact that Heron's devices were often seen as novelties. Many of his creations were used in temples, theaters, or courts, places of spectacle and ritual. They were admired, certainly, but rarely replicated at scale. Ancient engineers didn't think in terms of mass production or automation for convenience. These machines were impressive, but often isolated like a one-of-a-kind magician's trick. Heron himself never described them as practical tools for daily use. He wrote of them with wonder, not commerce. Moreover, much of his work was lost during the slow unraveling of Roman and Byzantine knowledge. What remained was copied, recopied, sometimes mistranslated and misunderstood. For centuries, no one built another vending machine. The cultural conditions behind the coin. It's worth reflecting on what made Heron's invention possible. First, coins were widespread. Ancient Greece had a robust monetary economy. By Heron's time in Rome and Egypt, coinage was used in temples, markets, and homes. The concept of inserting a token to receive something in return would have made intuitive sense. Second, temple rituals were highly formalized. The consistent dispensing of holy water mirrored the desire for ritualistic order. People didn't want surprises in their spiritual routines. Third, Alexandria, the city where Heron lived, was a hub of learning, culture, and experimentation. With its famed library and multicultural population, it was a place where a Greek engineer could borrow ideas from Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. In other words, the vending machine wasn't just a product of engineering, it was the result of a very particular convergence of religion, economics, and culture. A mechanism out of time. Imagine being a temple goer in 70 CE. You drop a coin into a brass machine and water flows like magic. You say your prayers. You move on. You likely don't know you've just interacted with one of the first examples of automation in history. Now imagine being a Victorian inventor in 1880, designing the first coin-operated postcard dispenser. You believe you're doing something new. But you're not. You're following in the forgotten footsteps of Heron of Alexandria, whose little machine solved a little problem in a big temple. And perhaps that's the point. Not all history is grand battles and revolutions. Some of it is quiet levers and trickling water. Some of it is the problem of too many people taking too much holy water and one man's clever solution. But that leads us to a curious question. If Heron could invent the vending machine, what else did he build that the world forgot? You've just seen a coin fall, a lever tip, and a stream of holy water emerge from a bronze spout in a quiet Alexandrian temple. But Heron's mind did not rest on just one marvel. If his holy water dispenser was a glimpse into the practical, his other devices tell the story of a world where gears, weights, and boiling steam danced in service of wonder and sometimes control. Because Heron wasn't just an engineer. He was a man playing with time, pressure, and illusion. And what he built might just change the way you think about what the ancient world was truly capable of. Ilipo, the steam engine that went nowhere. Let's start with the most misunderstood invention of all, the Ilipo. You may have heard it called the first steam engine. Technically, that's not wrong. But what it actually was is more curious than revolutionary. Heron described the device in Pneumatica in the 1st century CE. It consisted of a hollow metal sphere mounted on an axis. When water was boiled in a connected cauldron, steam traveled through tubes into the sphere. The sphere had two bent nozzles on opposite sides, and as the steam escaped, it caused the entire thing to spin. It whirled, it hissed, It looked magical, but it powered nothing. The Eolipa was, in essence, a demonstration. It was never connected to gears or grinding stones or carts. It simply spun in place. The why of that is perhaps the most frustrating part of Heron's legacy. He had the basics of steam propulsion long before Watt, Newcomen, or Stephenson. But the ancient world had neither the social drive nor the economic structure to industrialize such a discovery. And Heron himself may have never seen it as more than a temple curiosity, a divine amusement, not a tool. Automatic temple doors, opened by fire. Another invention from Pneumatica may sound like science fiction to the untrained ear. Automatic doors. In reality, these weren't doors that sensed a person walking up to them, but they did open without human touch. Here how it worked. A fire was lit on an altar at the temple entrance. As the fire burned, it heated a sealed brass vessel filled with water beneath it. The pressure of the steam pushed water through hidden pipes into a container. As the container filled, it grew heavier and pulled a system of ropes and pulleys. The doors creaked open as if by divine will. After the fire was extinguished and the system cooled, the water would reverse direction, flowing back into the original container, and the doors would slowly close. Imagine being a worshiper watching the great doors of the temple part by themselves, just as the fire offering was made. Magic. No hydraulics. But it would have felt divine, and that was the point. Heron's machines often served this performative purpose, not merely to function but to invoke awe. They created the illusion that gods accepted offerings instantly, that temples were alive with invisible power. It wasn't engineering. As utility, it was engineering as theater. The mechanics of myth, automata on the stage. While temples were Heron's favorite venue, theaters were his playground. Alexandria, after all, was a city of ideas, but also of entertainment. Plays were popular, and Heron was fascinated with what he called automatons, mechanical figures that moved on their own. He designed miniature puppet theaters that performed entire short plays using weights, strings, gears, and rotating drums. One such automaton included a chariot that rolled onto a miniature stage, a goddess figure that rose from the chariot, raising one arm, sound effects created by air rushing through hidden tubes, a finale in which the stage scene reset itself, ready for the next show. This was more than tinkering, it was early programming. The sequence of movements was determined by the placement of pegs and pulleys, essentially encoding instructions into a mechanical system. In modern terms, it was the same principle behind a player piano or a Jacquard loom. It's startling to consider. While the world around Heron worshipped gods and empires, he was scripting robots to perform plays. Why none of it changed the world? At this point, it's tempting to ask, why didn't these inventions spark an industrial revolution? The short answer, society didn't need it. Heron lived in a slave-based economy. Labor was cheap, abundant, and considered far more reliable than untested machines. There was no pressing economic incentive to replace workers with automation. Why engineer a mill when you could own 100 men? Second, Greek science was often theoretical. Heron was unusual in his love of mechanics, but most philosophers of the time valued geometry and metaphysics over machinery. Practical applications were often dismissed as the work of craftsmen, not scholars. Finally, there was no infrastructure to mass produce or widely share these inventions. Heron's texts were read by a few and appreciated by fewer. The manuscripts survived in some Greek and Arabic translations, but their practical influence was limited. His genius echoed through the centuries, but it didn't build factories. It lingered in the libraries, waiting. Heron's influence on later thinkers. Strangely, Heron may have had more influence centuries after his death than during his lifetime. His works were translated into Arabic in the Islamic Golden Age, and scholars such as Al-Jazari and Banu Musa read them, adapted them, and improved upon them. Al-Jazari's 12th century Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices features fountains, automata, and even early clocks that owe a quiet debt to Heron's treatises. In the European Renaissance, copies of Pneumatica re-emerged. Thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Giovanni Battista della Porta were fascinated by Heron's machines. But again, admiration did not equal adoption. It wasn't until the Enlightenment, and then the Industrial Revolution, that the full implications of automation, hydraulics, and steam were embraced. By then, Heron was a curiosity, a historical footnote, not a cornerstone. Yet his machines remained silent witnesses, not failures, just early. Revisiting the holy water machine. With all this in mind, return for a moment to that unassuming holy water vending machine. It's more than a clever mechanism, it's a symbol of what might have been. Heron's world had the tools: coins, gears, levers, steam. What it lacked was momentum. His inventions solved problems that were too specific or too ahead of their time. They emerged in a culture that prized spectacle over industry, rituals over replication. And yet, for one brief shining moment in Alexandria, machines did move on their own. Water flowed from a temple wall, not by priestly hand, but by precision engineering. It may not have changed the world, but it showed the world what could be. Which raises a thought we still struggle with today. Is every invention only as powerful as the society that surrounds it? Let's take a deep breath. Inhale the stillness of the ancient temple. The mechanical doors have just closed behind a group of worshippers. A puff of steam lingers in the air, and the holy water has stopped flowing. You've seen the machine work. You know now it wasn't magic, but a delicate balance of weights, valves, and levers. The invention was forgotten, recovered, admired, and then shelved again. But history is a long arc, and Heron's ghost didn't vanish. It simply waited in the blueprints of future minds. This final section isn't just about Heron. It's about what came after, and how long it took for the world to really catch up to a man who built machines before we were ready to use them. A society not ready for machines. To appreciate Heron's strange place in history, we need to look at the absence of machines in the ancient world. While Heron and a few others dabbled in automation, their ideas were exceptions, not norms. The Greeks had complex mathematics, metallurgy, and waterworks, but little interest in using machines for labor. Why? 1. Manual labor was cheap and ubiquitous. Slavery was not only widespread, but deeply embedded into the social structure. Tasks that might benefit from mechanization, such as grinding grain, hauling goods, or irrigating fields, were simply performed by enslaved people or the poor. 2. Status was tied to leisure, not innovation. The elite valued intellectual pursuits, philosophy, poetry, and astronomy. Engineering was often viewed as a lesser discipline. Skilled engineers like Heron were often seen as entertainers, not revolutionaries. 3. No industrial feedback loop. For an industrial society to form, one invention must lead to another, powering economic incentives, reinvestment, and systemization. Ancient societies were static. They did not seek exponential growth. Heron's vending machine worked. His steam engine worked. But nobody asked, what else could this do? Building the long pause, 1,500 years of silence. After the fall of the Roman Empire and the decline of Alexandria, the ancient world's mechanical ingenuity faded. Heron's works survived barely in fragments copied by scribes. For over a millennium, the Eolipal gathered metaphorical dust in manuscripts. The temple doors stayed shut. The vending machine sat idle in imagination. When Europe stirred again during the Renaissance, humanism and rediscovery were in vogue. Texts from the Islamic world began to reintroduce forgotten ideas, including those of Heron. In the 16th century, Giovanni Battista della Porta referenced Heron's ideas in Magia Naturalis, marveling at the power of heat and pressure. In the 17th century, engineers began experimenting again with pneumatics and hydraulics not as temple tricks, but as mechanisms with practical use. And then came Thomas Savery, Thomas Newcomen, and James Watt. The Aeolipos descendant, powered now by iron, coal, and capitalism, no longer spun for spectacle. It pumped water from mines. It drove pistons. It revolutionized transport. Heron's ideas had finally found a world that needed them. Shopping cart from holy water to soda cans, the vending machine returns. Meanwhile, Heron's original invention, the coin-operated dispenser, reappeared in a very different form. 1880s London, almost 1,800 years later. Percival Everett invented a machine that dispensed postcards. It was designed for railway stations, where foot traffic was high and clerks were too few. Soon came other machines. Chewing gum in the US, chocolates in Germany, cigarettes and matches in France. All coin-operated, all based on the same principles Heron used. Eventually, vending machines evolved into automated kiosks, hot food dispensers, coffee robots, and even touchless biometric paywalls. Yet at their core, they remained what Heron first designed: mechanical fairness. Insert a coin, receive a measured good. No haggling, no gatekeeper, just the quiet efficiency of gears and gravity. Robot face echoes in modern automation. Heron's deeper legacy goes far beyond vending machines. It lives in the very idea of automation machines, replacing humans for tasks once thought uniquely manual. From factory lines to 3D printers, from motion sensor doors to AI-driven customer service bots, the spirit of Heron's temple creations lingers. His machines didn't just perform functions. They responded to input. They executed a preset routine. They returned to their original state. Input right arrow process, right arrow, output right arrow reset. The fundamentals of mechanical logic. Heron built the first conditional machines. We just added electricity and silicon. Light bulb, what we learned from forgotten genius. There's a quiet sadness in Heron's story. He saw possibilities that others ignored. He lived in a society that could not see beyond spectacle. He built working prototypes of the future and watched them become novelties. But maybe the point isn't whether Heron changed the world. Maybe the point is that he could have. And so, what do we do with people like Heron? Do we call them before their time? Do we mourn the opportunities lost? Or do we learn from them that ideas alone are not enough? Inventions are like seeds. Without the right soil, they don't grow. Heron planted many. The modern world is their garden. Final reflection. The vending machine at the temple wasn't just a gadget. It was a mechanical sermon. It spoke to fairness, function, and foresight. It solved a small problem. But in doing so, it quietly posed a larger question, one that still echoes in the automated systems around you today. When machines can replace people, who decides when they should? Story 2. The water clocks of Babylon, timekeeping before time. You awaken in the dim silence of a Babylonian temple, the scent of oil lamps thick in the air. Outside, the first rays of dawn creep across the baked earth of Mesopotamia. But inside, something else marks the beginning of the day. Not a rooster, not the sun, but a slow, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. A vessel fills, time passes, another vessel empties, time is measured. This is not a clock in the way we think of, one knot of gears and ticking hands, but it is timekeeping. Not with precision, but with patience. Welcome to the age of the clepsydra, the water clock. Long before atomic clocks, before pendulums swung under polished brass casings, humans measured time by the steady, predictable movement of water. And in the ancient cities of Babylon, where writing was born and laws were etched in stone, the water clock became a quiet force behind ritual, justice, and empire. Water waved the concept of time before clocks. In our world of constant notifications and digital alarms, it's difficult to imagine a civilization without clocks. But for most of human history, time wasn't kept by seconds or minutes, it was felt, observed, and estimated. Early humans measured time by the position of the sun, sundials, shadow sticks; seasonal changes, plant cycles, star patterns; natural cues, birdsong, tides, moon phases. But these were all external, environmental. What if you needed to measure time indoors, or during the night, or for something more complex like how long a speech should be, or the timing of a priest's chant? This is where the water clock quietly entered history. Classical. Why Babylon? Babylon, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, was not only fertile ground for agriculture, it was fertile for ideas. By 1800 BCE, Babylonian civilization was one of the most advanced on Earth. With its scribes, astronomers, priests, and bureaucrats, it was a society that craved structure and order. Babylonians tracked celestial events with remarkable accuracy, created some of the earliest known calendars, developed a base 60 number system. Yes, that's why we have 60 seconds in a minute. But to support this elaborate system of law, astronomy, and religion, they needed a way to measure time that didn't depend on sunlight. So they turned to the most reliable flow they knew: water. Balance. The clepsydra, mechanics of a Babylonian water clock. Clepsydra is the Greek term meaning water thief. But the concept is far older. Babylonian records from as early as 1600 BCE refer to devices that used dripping or flowing water to measure time. Let's imagine how it worked. A stone or ceramic vessel was filled with water. A small hole at the base allowed water to escape slowly and steadily. As the water drained, markings on the inside or a secondary vessel could track how much time had passed. When the water reached a certain point, the designated interval, an hour, a watch, a chant, was complete. Sometimes, instead of draining, water was added into a vessel from a constant source, with time measured as the level rose. Simple, silent, effective. These devices had no bells, no moving parts, just gravity and patience. Books, tablets, temples, and timekeeping. Evidence of Babylonian water clocks is fragmentary but compelling. Cuneiform tablets mention the term nepeshu, referring to units of time. Ritual texts describe precise durations for prayers and offerings. Astronomical texts from Babylon, like the Mulapin series, show that priests measured the length of night watches in the absence of sunlight, likely using water clocks. The Enuma Anu Enlil, an enormous compendium of celestial omens, required accurate tracking of planetary motion. Without water clocks, how else could they have measured the timing of eclipses or planetary risings after dark? In temples, water clocks weren't just practical, they were sacred. Timekeeping was not a neutral act. It was a way to align human activity with the rhythms of the cosmos. The drip of water was not just a tick. It was the voice of the divine. Balance. Clocks of judgment and justice. Outside temples, water clocks also served a more bureaucratic purpose: judicial timing. In some Near Eastern cultures, speeches in courts were timed by clepsydras. A speaker might be allowed one vessel of water to plead his case. This wasn't about precision but fairness, ensuring one party didn't dominate the other with endless words. Later civilizations, like the Greeks and Romans, adopted this idea for legal hearings. But it began, most likely, with Babylonian water clocks. Time became law. and law needed something neutral to hold it. Microscope challenges of early timekeeping. Of course, water clocks weren't perfect. Temperature affected viscosity, causing the water to flow faster or slower. Clogging of the hole could disrupt the rate. Evaporation was a constant enemy in dry climates. Nighttime calibration required skilled attendants to check progress in torchlight. And then there was the issue of measurement units. Without standardization, one clepsydra might drain faster than another. In Babylon, this was often solved by assigning priests or scribes the task of calibrating the clocks by observation. This wasn't timekeeping for convenience, it was timekeeping as ritual labor. Even the most boring maintenance task, refilling water, cleaning spouts, adjusting flow, was part of keeping the empire synchronized. Milky Way time, astronomy and Babylonian legacy. Ultimately, Babylonian timekeeping wasn't about daily scheduling or personal punctuality. It was about cosmic alignment. Time was measured not for its own sake, but to predict eclipses, solstices, equinoxes, omens. The priests of Marduk weren't just marking hours. They were aligning city life with the heavens. Their clocks didn't just keep time, they kept order. Later cultures would inherit this sense of sacred time. The Egyptians used water clocks to track hours at night in tomb rituals. The Greeks added more precise scales and external indicators. The Indians and Chinese developed their own versions, many influenced by Babylonian techniques via trade routes. But it started here, with a slow drip in the desert. A clock meant to be felt. So often we think of clocks as cold things ticking, blinking, beeping. But the Babylonian water clock was different. It had no sound except the soft splash of droplets. It marked time not by interruption but by flow. Time wasn't imposed. It moved gently beside you. The clepsydra was humble. It did not demand your attention. It waited. It taught patience, and it worked best when left alone. It was not a stopwatch. It was a whisper from the river. Which brings us to a curious thought. If ancient people could feel time through water, have we forgotten something in our obsession with speed? The Babylonian night sky was a scroll, and its stars were inked with omens. Beneath it, a vessel slowly filled with water, each drop tracking the passage of hours too dark to count. The priests of Marduk consulted tablets. The vessel dripped. The heavens turned. Time, though invisible, had found a rhythm measured not by sundials or stars, but by water falling into clay. This section explores how these early clocks were used not just to keep time, but to maintain an entire worldview, a Babylonian concept of order that extended from temple rituals to astronomy to imperial bureaucracy. And as we'll see, the clock may have been boring in function, but its implications were monumental. Timekeeping in the temple, synchronizing with the divine. The Babylonian temple was not merely a house of worship, it was an administrative hub, a school, and an astronomical observatory. And timekeeping played a central role in all of these. Priests used clepsydras to measure the duration of night watches for astronomical observations. Time prayers, rituals, and incense offerings. Keep order in complex temple routines that often involve dozens of specialized roles. The Book of Enuma, Anu, Enlil, mentioned in Section 1, contains hundreds of astrological omens. These depended not just on which star appeared, but when. And since many celestial events occurred in darkness, a timekeeper with a water clock became as essential as the stargazer. In effect, the temple functioned as a time observatory. The clepsydra was not just a device, it was a tether between heaven and earth. The bureaucratic role of the water clock. Beyond religion, Babylonian society was held together by record-keeping. Taxation, agriculture, civic duties, and legal proceedings all depended on accounting for time. Consider irrigation. The Babylonian calendar was divided into lunar months, but crops needed daily care. Irrigation workers, known as dekaru, rotated duties to open or close canal gates. The only reliable way to ensure fairness in these shifts, especially at night, was to assign each worker a watch measured by a clepsydra. Each watch might last 1 or 2 water pots, depending on the vessel's size. Supervisors kept logs, cuneiform tablets noting which fields were watered when and by whom. This wasn't an abstract act. It affected crop yields, taxes, and ultimately survival. The water clock, quiet and slow, was a tool of imperial logistics. Law and the clock, time as a legal measure. Imagine standing in a Babylonian court. A scribe sits beside a clay vessel, watching it slowly drain. You have until the water empties to plead your case. This wasn't theater, it was practice. Though documentation is sparse, later Mesopotamian legal texts suggest that time limits on speeches or statements were enforced using measured vessels. This likely emerged from Babylonian precedent. The clock ensured equity between plaintiffs. It discouraged rambling or manipulative rhetoric. And importantly, it made justice measurable. In a culture that revered law, Hammurabi's code had been chiseled in stone for all to see. This mattered. The clepsydra served as an impartial observer. It could not be bribed. It did not care who you were. It merely counted. Problems of precision, the flaws they understood. While Babylonian water clocks were remarkably advanced for their time, they were not without flaws, and Babylonians knew it. Cuneiform records note that cold weather slowed water flow. Algae and sediment clogged small holes. Evaporation skewed night measurements in summer. Pottery thickness affected flow rates subtly but significantly. To compensate, elite temples kept calibrated clocks, multiple clepsydras tested against celestial observations. Adjustments were made seasonally. Flow rates were checked against the duration of moonrise. This was not automation. This was maintenance, an act of faith and vigilance. In a way, the imperfection of water clocks mirrored the Babylonian view of the cosmos, orderly, but only with human intervention. A universe that needed watching. Star maps and time charts, Babylonian astronomy and the clock. Perhaps the most stunning use of water clocks was in astronomy. The Babylonians are credited with some of the oldest star charts and mathematical models of planetary motion. They divided the sky into 3 paths, Enlil, Anu, and E zones through which celestial bodies traveled. To track these with precision, especially over long nights, priests relied on timekeeping tools. Water clocks allowed for timed recordings of when a star appeared or disappeared, predictions of eclipses and conjunctions, calculation of seasonal shift and omen timings. In some ways, the clepsydra enabled data collection centuries before the scientific method. Modern astronomers depend on synchronized clocks and telescopes. Babylonian priests, watching stars from ziggurat rooftops, depended on the drip of water. The clock as a tool of empire. When you consider the scale of the Babylonian Empire, its sprawling trade routes, city planning, and tax systems, you realize something crucial. You cannot govern without time. Agricultural cycles had to be aligned across regions. Priests in had to match festivals with those in Sippar. Taxation deadlines had to be enforced. Soldiers rotated watches on city walls, day and night. The water clock helped achieve this coherence. It made time portable, standardized, and quantifiable even without sunlight. Much like Heron's vending machine in Alexandria, the clepsydra was a device that regulated behavior without oversight. A governance tool hiding in a pot. Archaeological traces, what remains? Unlike stone sundials or bronze gears, water clocks were made of ceramic, stone, or clay, fragile materials that rarely survive intact. Still, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of conical vessels with calibration lines inside, drain holes with evidence of wear, texts describing libation durations, matching watch periods. At the British Museum, a small Babylonian pot is displayed with a narrow hole at its base. It's labeled simply as a ritual vessel, but many scholars believe it was a clepsydra misunderstood for decades. It's a reminder of how the most boring objects often held profound significance. Time before the clock. It's tempting to think of clocks as inevitable, as if they were always destined to exist. But the water clock tells another story, a story of people trying to observe, contain, and share time long before it ticked. Babylonians didn't ask, "What time is it?" They asked, "How much time has passed?" Their clocks didn't forecast minutes, they measured moments, long enough to irrigate a field, or read a star, or finish a prayer. We think of time as linear, but for Babylon, time was circular, ritualized, and sacred. And each drop in a clepsydra was like a bead in a rosary, small, silent, and sacred. But that leads us to a puzzle. If time was once sacred, how did it become a tool of labor and punishment? Drip by drip, the clepsydra measured time. But across the centuries, the clock's purpose would change. In Babylon, it marked sacred hours and celestial movements. But as civilizations rose and fell, timekeeping slowly transformed from a ritual act into a system of control. This final section explores how water clocks spread beyond Babylon, how they evolved into tools of imperial power and public discipline, and how, eventually, they paved the way for our modern conception of time, not just what time is, but what it's for. From temples to factories, from priests to punch clocks, the silent flow of water gave birth to something far louder, the tick of the modern world. The journey of the clepsydra. Though Babylon may have refined and ritualized the clepsydra, they were not its final keepers. The concept of water-based timekeeping spread through trade, conquest, and imitation. As Babylon's influence waned, its technologies and texts passed into the hands of its successors. Let's follow the clock's journey. Egypt. In Egyptian temples, especially during the New Kingdom, c. 1550–1070 BCE, water clocks were used to time nighttime rituals. One of the most famous examples is a large alabaster clepsydra found at the Temple of Karnak, shaped like a deep bowl with sloped sides and internal markings. It was designed to fill at a constant rate, allowing priests to track nocturnal hours during ceremonies to Amun-Ra. Egyptian clepsydras were often larger and more decorated than Babylonian ones. Their use was still sacred, but now linked to the hour, a division Egypt helped codify. India. Indian texts like the Surya Siddhanta and Aryabhatiya mention water clocks, Gati Yantra, used by astronomers to track solar and lunar cycles. These were vital in Vedic ritual timing and astrology. In some regions, conch shell clepsydras floated inside tanks, calibrated to sync after a certain time interval. Greece and Rome. The Greeks adopted the clepsydra and used it extensively in law courts, where water limited speaking time. By the Hellenistic period, engineers like C. Ctesibius of Alexandria had improved the clepsydra with gears, floats, and dials, making the flow more regular and readable. Romans brought these improvements west. In public spaces, ornate water clocks were used not only for function but display. One Roman clepsydra in the Forum might even hiss or whistle to mark the passage of an hour. From spiritual tool to political instrument, the clepsydra was changing. When time becomes discipline. By the time of the Roman Empire, the clepsydra had evolved into a regulatory device. In military camps, it tracked shifts and guard rotations. In public baths, it was used to restrict the length of bathing sessions. And in courts, it became a weapon of rhetoric, less about fairness, more about silencing opposition. This transition from ritual time to regimented time marks a civilizational shift. No longer was time something honored. It became something allocated. By the early Middle Ages, this philosophy of measured time reached a strange climax in monasteries. Monasteries and the invention of the clock mindset. Christian monastic life, especially among the Benedictines, emphasized prayers at specific times: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. But how do you pray at 3:00 a.m. without a sunrise? Some monasteries used water clocks and later candle clocks to keep schedule through the night. Over time, monastic communities began creating increasingly elaborate clock mechanisms to ring bells automatically. Here, time became more than a tool. It became a discipline structuring every action of every day. In a way, the spiritual focus of Babylon had returned, but within cloistered walls. Eventually, these monastic time practices would influence town clocks, market hours, and later factories. What began as divine devotion had become a system for social regulation. From clepsydra to clocktour. By the 13th century, mechanical clocks began appearing in Europe. No water, no priests. Just gears, escapements, and bells. But the philosophy of the water clock lived on. That time is divisible. That time must be measured. That time should be shared across society. Clock towers arose in town squares, not just to tell time but to control it. They regulated market openings, work hours, legal deadlines, religious observances. The drip had become a tick. The temple had become the factory. Time as authority. And then came industrialization. In the 19th century, factory whistles replaced bells. Time wasn't just measured, it was owned. Workers clocked in. Every second became productive time or wasted time. Management demanded precision. Late arrivals were fined. In Babylon, time was sacred. In the industrial age, time was capital. The clepsydra's spiritual rhythm had become the heartbeat of a profit machine. We stopped measuring time by the flow of water and started measuring ourselves by the clock on the wall. The loss of fluid time. Something else was lost along the way. The clepsydra taught patience. Its sound was soft, its pace was slow. It did not rush, it did not stress. But today, we measure in milliseconds. We demand speed. We've turned time from a companion into a competitor. Maybe that's why we often feel out of sync, anxious, overworked, late for everything. Our clocks are sharper than ever, but our sense of time has become brittle. What would happen if we measured time differently? With the sound of water. With silence. With flow. Final reflections, the clock that made us human. The Babylonian water clock was not just a container for water, it was a container for meaning. It reflected a world where time connected earth and sky, balanced ritual and reality, measured justice and devotion, flowed gently beside us. In a sense, the clepsydra was the first machine for mindfulness. Not demanding, not exacting, just being. And though it's long gone, its shape still lingers. In how we structure our days, in how we count and divide, in the ticking things around us. Because time was never just measured by tools. It was made by humans trying always to give shape to the formless. And so we end with a question. In all our precision, have we forgotten how to feel time flow? Story 3. Roman concrete, the secret that built an empire. You walk through the ruins of an ancient Roman bathhouse. Columns rise into the sky, fractured yet majestic. Archways remain defiantly curved. Even after 2 millennia, the walls still stand, cracked, worn, but not collapsed. The air smells of moss and dust, and somewhere nearby, water still echoes against stone. What holds it all together? Not gods, not gold. Concrete, but not the kind we use today. The Romans had their own formula opus cementitium, and it was unlike anything the world had seen before or has quite replicated since. This is not a story of war or politics, though Rome had plenty. This is a story about materials, about volcanic ash, about underwater docks, about ancient engineers who accidentally or perhaps deliberately created a concrete so durable it survived history. And it's also about how we lost that knowledge. The Roman construction revolution. Rome did not begin with concrete. Early Roman architecture mimicked the Greeks: columns, stone blocks, post and lintel structures. But stone, while elegant, was expensive and labor-intensive. It limited both the scale and shape of construction. By the 3rd century BCE, Roman builders began experimenting with binding agents, materials that could hold together rubble, broken stone, and sand. The result was a game-changer: concrete. With it, Rome could build faster, build cheaper, build bigger. Concrete wasn't used as a surface finish, it was poured, shaped, and hidden behind brick or marble facades. What you saw was grandeur. What held it all up was gray and grainy. In time, Roman concrete would underpin aqueducts, temples, markets, amphitheaters, harbors, entire cities. This wasn't just a material, it was a tool of empire. The ingredients, simple yet strange. So, what exactly was in Roman concrete? The core ingredients were surprisingly humble. Lime calcium oxide, produced by heating limestone. Volcanic ash, pozzolana, especially prized when sourced near the Bay of Naples. Water, the catalyst. Aggregate small rocks, broken tiles, bricks, or pumice. When mixed, this created a chemical reaction that allowed the concrete to set under water and gain strength over time. That's key. Unlike modern Portland cement, Roman concrete got stronger as it aged. The volcanic ash, rich in silica and alumina, reacted with the lime to form calcium aluminum silicate hydrate, a resilient binder resistant to cracking. Modern engineers have marveled at this. They only rediscovered the chemistry in detail in the last few decades. To put it simply, Rome built things to last because their concrete behaved more like rock than modern cement. Pozzolana, the gift of fire. At the heart of Roman concrete's strength was pozzolana, a volcanic ash named after Pozzuoli, near Naples. This region, part of the Phlegrean Fields, was geologically active, full of fuming craters and mineral-rich soils. Roman engineers noticed something extraordinary. Structures built with pozzolana and lime could harden underwater. That meant harbors could be built in situ, rather than on land and lowered into the sea. Bridges could be anchored directly into riverbeds. Aqueduct piers could rise from lakes or marshes. One of the best examples, Portus Julius, Rome's first major naval base, built around 37 BCE. Its breakwaters were formed by pouring concrete into wooden forms submerged in water, something modern engineers struggled to replicate until the 20th century. Even more remarkable, these underwater structures are still standing. 2,000 years later. The Pantheon, a concrete miracle. No discussion of Roman concrete is complete without mentioning the Pantheon in Rome. Built by Emperor Hadrian around 126 CE, it remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Let that sink in. 43.3 meters in diameter. No steel supports. No modern reinforcement. How did they do it? They varied the aggregate, heavier basalt at the base, lighter pumice toward the top. They reduced weight as the dome rose. They shaped the interior with coffers, sunken panels that lightened the load without weakening the structure. And the oculus, the open skylight at the dome's peak, served both symbolic and structural roles, reducing the pressure at the dome's highest stress point. 2,000 years later, the dome still stands. Tourists walk under it, rain falls through it. Nothing else in concrete comes close. Not just monuments, concrete in daily life. While monuments like the Pantheon and Colosseum get the attention, Roman concrete quietly shaped everyday life too. Apartments insulae in cities like Ostia were made with concrete cores. Streets were paved with concrete underlayers for drainage. Warehouses, markets, and latrines used concrete for quick, durable construction. It allowed Rome to standardize buildings across its provinces. Wherever the empire expanded from Britain to Syria, concrete followed. In effect, the same recipe that built temples in Rome was used to build bathhouses in Gaul. It was empire by bucket. Why was it forgotten? With all this success, it's a wonder that Roman concrete wasn't refined and improved over time. Instead, it vanished. Several factors contributed. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, 5th century CE, led to the collapse of the centralized knowledge base. Pozzolana sources became inaccessible or forgotten. Medieval builders favored stone and mortar, easier to reuse, repair, and understand. Written engineering knowledge was lost or ignored. For over 1,000 years, no one built with concrete like the Romans. Even the Renaissance, with all its innovation, didn't rediscover it fully. When modern concrete was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was inferior in some ways to what Rome had already achieved. Strong, yes, but prone to cracking, erosion, and degradation. It took chemical engineers in the 20th and 21st centuries to fully analyze Roman concrete and begin to understand what had been lost. Imagine that. We reinvented the wheel and made it worse. A material philosophy. What made Roman concrete so special wasn't just its ingredients. It was how it reflected Roman thinking. Pragmatic, they built fast and cheap but not disposable. Contextual, they adapted the mix to each purpose. Durable, they didn't just build for the present, they built for centuries. Their concrete wasn't a throwaway material. It was a foundation not just of cities, but of civilization. And in that, it leaves us with a question that lingers even as their ruins remain. What does it say about a society when its buildings last longer than its memory? The humblest Roman tenement and the grandest imperial harbor shared something in common. They were built from the same material, concrete. From aqueducts to amphitheaters, from bathhouses to boundary walls, opus caementitium was the backbone of Roman daily life. But more than a building material, it became a kind of imperial signature, the mark of Rome's presence and permanence. In this section, we leave the temples and monuments and look closer at the people, processes, and principles behind the Roman concrete revolution. We'll examine how laborers worked with it, how engineers thought about it, and how Rome's expansion across 3 continents was shaped literally by what could be poured into place. Because to build an empire, you don't just need armies. You need mortar. Concrete in the Roman apartment block, the insula. Let's start on the street level. By the 1st century CE, the population of Rome had swelled to over 1 million, a number unmatched by any city in Europe, until London in the 19th century. Housing such a mass of people required not palaces but insulae, multi-story apartment blocks made quickly, affordably, and vertically. Concrete made this possible. Builders could pour concrete into timber forms rather than cutting stone. They used rubble as filler, often reusing broken bricks, potsherds, and discarded materials. Once cured, the concrete formed solid walls, hidden behind stucco or painted plaster. These weren't luxury homes. Most were cramped, dark, and poorly ventilated. Yet without concrete, such density of living would have been impossible. In a strange way, Rome's concrete fed both extremes of society, the grandeur of emperors and the grime of urban tenants. Concrete in public infrastructure. Where concrete truly shined was in the public sphere. Consider the Roman bathhouse. Vaulted ceilings, heating systems, waterproof pools all made with concrete. Builders used pozzolanic mortars that resisted humidity and mineral corrosion. Floors and walls were sometimes coated with opus signinum, a waterproof plaster made from crushed tiles and lime. Concrete allowed these massive complexes to include caldaria hot rooms, frigidaria cold rooms, tepidaria warm rooms, and natations pools, all under one engineered roof. And the Romans loved their baths. In cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, even modest neighborhoods had access to public bathing. The idea of hygiene, ritual, and practical was democratized through architecture. Without concrete, none of it would have been scalable. Roads, bridges, and beyond. Roman roads are famous, but their underlayers were often formed with early concrete mixes. A base layer of rudous rubble and lime set the foundation, followed by nucleus, a finer concrete layer mixed with ash and sand. On top, large paving stones were laid in systematic grids. This layering gave Roman roads their legendary longevity. Many still survive not just because of the stones we walk on, but because of the material underneath. Bridges, too, used concrete to anchor pilings in water. The Pons Fabricius in Rome, built in 62 BCE, still carries foot traffic today thanks in part to its pozzolanic foundations. Labor who built with concrete, but who actually mixed and poured all this material. Not engineers, not senators. Slaves, free laborers, soldiers, and guild workers formed the backbone of Roman construction. In fact, military engineers were often tasked with building forts, roads, and outposts using concrete, especially in frontier regions. Construction guilds, collegia, passed down techniques and recipes for mixtures and ratios. Manual laborers mixed lime and ash in open pits, carrying heavy loads with baskets and wooden yokes. A typical building crew might set timber forms for walls and arches, pour in layers of rubble and mortar, tamp the material to reduce air gaps, let it cure over days or weeks before removing the forms. It was dirty, exhausting work. And it built a world. Roman engineering manuals, what did they know? Much of what we know about Roman building methods comes from one man, Vitruvius. His De Architectura, written around 15 BCE, was part architectural guide, part philosophical treatise. In it, Vitruvius details concrete mix ratios, lime slaking techniques, pozzolana properties, proper wall dimensions for load-bearing structures. He stressed the importance of site selection, material sourcing, and aesthetics, but also emphasized durability. To Vitruvius, a building should have three qualities: formida's strength, utilita's function, and venusta's beauty. Concrete enabled all three. But it was the ash pulvis from Campania, as he called it, that gave Roman concrete its lasting power. He urged builders to seek the best pozzolana, noting that concrete made with it becomes every day more solid. And yet, despite his influence, many of Vitruvius's insights were lost or misunderstood for centuries. Concrete in the provinces, exporting the formula. As Rome expanded, so did its materials. In Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, and Britannia, Roman engineers built baths, basilicas, and barracks using locally adapted concrete. In regions without volcanic ash, other silicate-rich sands were used. In colder climates, concrete formulas were modified to cure slower or resist frost. In regions with stone shortages, concrete became the default building method. Thus, even in distant outposts, the empire carried its architectural DNA building in the Roman way. Concrete was not just a material, it was a cultural export. Concrete and the Roman worldview. It's worth pausing to consider what concrete represented to the Roman mind. Stone was eternal but slow. Brick was familiar but limited. Concrete, it was malleable, scalable, powerful. It enabled domes without ribs, vaults without buttresses, walls without seams. It allowed for new architectural forms, basilicas, ovals, and half-domes not just borrowed from the Greeks, but invented by the Romans. In a way, concrete was political. It enabled infrastructure for control, monuments for legitimacy, and housing for placation. Rome's greatness wasn't just in law or language. It was in its ability to reshape space itself. A legacy poured, layer by layer. By the 2nd century CE, the Roman concrete industry was at full throttle. No other ancient civilization matched its reach or output. And yet the builders left few names. We remember the emperors. We visit the forums. But the men who mixed lime and ash, who poured the walls and smoothed the vaults, they are anonymous. Their work, however, endures. In ruins, in walls, in breakwaters still battered by the sea. They gave their labor to a material built not just for the living, but for time itself. So we're left with a curious thought. Did the Romans know their concrete would outlast their empire? The last stone has been laid. The scaffolding is removed. A Roman amphitheater opens its gates to the roar of the crowd. Beneath the marble facades and statues of emperors, what truly holds it all together is concrete hidden, gray, and unglamorous. And yet, centuries later, when the emperors have been forgotten and the empire has long since fractured, what remains? Not the people, not the power, but the walls, the arches, the foundations, the concrete still standing. We explore how Roman concrete disappeared from use, how its secrets were only partially rediscovered in modern times, and what it might teach us in a world increasingly aware of the fragility of our own infrastructure. Because Rome's greatest achievement wasn't just that it built an empire. It's that the empire still stands beneath the ruins. From glory to rubble, the disappearance of Roman concrete. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, building practices changed dramatically. Cities shrank. Trade routes broke down. Specialized labor disappeared. Knowledge passed by apprenticeship was lost. Without consistent access to pozzolana, and without an institutional memory of how Roman concrete was made, builders reverted to earlier techniques. Stone and mortar, wood framing, bricklaying with lime plaster. The grandeur of concrete, its ability to mold vast domes and uninterrupted vaults, faded from memory. Even the Pantheon, still standing, was misunderstood. Medieval visitors marveled at it but didn't understand how it was built. The engineering manuals of men like Vitruvius were preserved in monasteries and libraries, but often seen as curiosities outdated or incomprehensible. Rome's greatest material triumph became a relic, hidden in plain sight. A slow rediscovery, the Renaissance and beyond. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in Roman architecture. Artists and architects like Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon, measuring its dimensions and marveling at its dome. But without access to ancient concrete, they reinvented rather than replicated. Builders in Florence and Venice used brick and mortar to emulate Roman forms. Meanwhile, scholars began translating ancient texts, including Vitruvius, but many misunderstood his descriptions of pozzolanic chemistry. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that scientists and engineers began truly rediscovering concrete's properties. Key moments in modern concrete. 1756, British engineer John Smeaton discovers a hydraulic lime that sets underwater. 1824, Joseph Espdin patents Portland cement, the basis for most modern concrete. 1850, 1900, reinforced concrete is developed using steel bars to counteract tensile stress. 20th century, massive structures like the Hoover Dam and the Panama Canal are built with modern concrete. And yet, despite the advances, one truth became clear. Modern concrete deteriorates, Roman concrete doesn't. Modern science meets ancient ash. In the 21st century, researchers finally began analyzing Roman concrete at the microscopic level. Using electron microscopes, X-ray diffraction, and other modern tools, they discovered the key binding mineral in Roman concrete is calcium, aluminum silicate, hydrate CaSH. Roman marine concrete incorporates seawater, which reacts over time with volcanic ash to form aluminous tobermorite, a rare mineral that strengthens the matrix. Tiny cracks in Roman concrete self-heal through mineral crystal growth. This was not just strong cement, it was chemically dynamic, a material that got stronger with time. Modern concrete, by contrast, begins to degrade almost from the moment it sets. Infrastructure like bridges, dams, and highways often has a lifespan of 50–100 years and deteriorates due to cracking from thermal expansion, corrosion of internal steel reinforcement, chemical leaching, freeze-thaw cycles. Roman concrete has stood for 2,000 years without steel, without additives, and without maintenance crews. What we could learn. Modern engineers and climate scientists are now asking a crucial question. Should we go back to Roman methods? There's increasing interest in reviving or adapting low-carbon cement alternatives that mimic Roman techniques. Key benefits of Roman-style concrete. No need for steel reinforcement, reducing embedded carbon. Lower temperature production. Lime burns at lower temps than Portland cement. Greater longevity, reducing maintenance and replacement costs. Marine resilience, especially in saltwater environments. In a world where concrete production accounts for nearly 8% of global CO2 emissions, a return to natural pozzolanic binders could make a significant impact. What once built an empire might help preserve a planet. Concrete and the idea of permanence. There's something philosophical about concrete. The Romans believed in eternity. Their law, their language, their gods, they saw them as timeless. Concrete was a physical expression of that belief. A poured promise to the future. In a world where buildings are designed to last decades, not centuries, we might ask, what does it mean to build something meant to last? Not trendy, not replaceable, but permanent. The Romans didn't just build, they committed. And that's perhaps the greatest contrast between then and now. Concrete in the modern age, silent, ubiquitous, disposable. Today, concrete is the most widely used man-made material in the world. It forms the skeletons of our cities. It lines our tunnels, dams, and airports. It's used in everything from skyscrapers to septic tanks. And yet most of it is invisible. Unseen, unappreciated, taken for granted. It crumbles, it cracks. We replace it. But Rome didn't think that way. For them, a wall was a statement, a harbor was a legacy, a dome was a defiance of time. Final reflection, a material worth remembering. Roman concrete teaches us that materials matter not just in structure, but in philosophy. It shows that longevity can be designed. Nature, volcanic ash, can offer better solutions than synthetic fixes. Forgotten knowledge can still build our future. In the end, perhaps the most boring material in Rome wasn't boring at all. It held cities together. It preserved culture. It whispered across time, and it asks us now, if we build for speed, for cost, for now, what will remain of us 2,000 years from today? Story 4. Postal Routes of the Persian Empire, the original express mail. The desert wind carries dust across a broad road, a road paved not with stones, but with ambition. Along its edge stands a way station, a squat stone building, shaded by a small awning, guarded by silence and waiting. Inside, a satchel of scrolls rests on a carved bench. At the horizon, a blur of movement appears, a rider at full gallop, dust trailing behind him. He dismounts, swaps the satchel, and is gone within moments. The man speaks no words. He doesn't stop to rest. He has only one job: to carry the king's message across a continent. Long before email, before telegraphs, before air mail, there was the Persian Angarium, a vast, organized system of couriers, roads, and posts that allowed the kings of Persia to send messages faster than any empire before them. And the strangest part, it worked brilliantly, silently, and with a speed that stunned even the Greeks. The Achaemenid Empire, a need for speed. Founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire quickly became the largest the world had ever seen. At its height, it stretched from the Indus River in the east to Anatolia and the Aegean Sea in the west, from the Caspian Mountains in the north to the Persian Gulf and Nile Valley in the south. This wasn't just territory, it was diversity. The empire contained dozens of languages, cultures, and climates linked not by force alone, but by something more subtle: communication. For an empire to survive, orders must be sent, taxes must be requested, governors must report, rebels must be identified, supply chains must be coordinated. So Persia did something no civilization had ever done at scale. It built a road system, and it created a postal network that could move messages across thousands of kilometers in mere days. The Royal Road, backbone of the empire. The most famous of these arteries was known as the Royal Road, Hulagu Shahiya in Old Persian. Built during the reign of Darius I.C. 522–486 BCE, the Royal Road stretched approximately 2,700 kilometers, 1,700 miles, from Sardis in western Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, to Susa, one of the empire's capitals near the Persian Gulf. What made the Royal Road exceptional was not just its length, but its functionality. Way stations, called chaparkhane, were placed every 25–30 kilometers. Each station had fresh horses, supplies, and messengers waiting. Couriers swapped mounts and continued immediately, day or night. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the system with admiration. Nothing mortal travels so fast as these Persian messengers. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with all speed. Sound familiar? That's because the United States Postal Service adapted this line, with slight alterations for its own motto. How the Angarium worked. The Angarium was the name of the imperial postal system, a logistical masterpiece built for the speed and certainty of state messaging. Let's walk through a single transmission. A clay tablet or sealed scroll is written at the capital, perhaps, containing military orders or news of the king's health. A courier, angaros, is assigned. These were often elite riders, trained for endurance and trusted with royal messages. The angaros rides to the first relay station, where he dismounts, hands off the message, and receives a fresh mount. This process repeats every 20–30 kilometers, each segment handled by a new rider or refreshed mount. A message from Susa to Sardis could travel in about 7–9 days. On foot, it would have taken over 3 months. This was not a civilian service. Only royal messages or military communiques could use it. To interfere with a message or rider was to invite capital punishment. This network was an extension of the king's presence, a fast-moving arm of sovereignty. Chapar stations, the quiet machinery of empire. Each chapar station was a blend of simplicity and precision, usually built of stone or mud brick, staffed by station keepers who managed horses and provisions. Located in strategic intervals, near rivers, oases, or hills for visibility. Equipped with stables, water troughs, grain storage, and shelter. These were not inns. They were military-grade relay nodes designed to keep a horse moving at full speed. Some stations kept multiple horses ready at all times, selected for stamina over speed. They weren't race horses, they were logistical tools. And the system's efficiency wasn't based on technology. It was based on coordination, which required administrators, the bureaucrats behind the messages. Running an empire-wide postal network required more than roads and horses. It required scribes to copy and prepare messages in multiple languages, linguists to ensure the correct dialects for each satrapy province, administrators to assign routes, approve messages, and monitor delivery timelines, inspectors to audit stations, verify horse health, and enforce discipline. Darius I, famed for his organizational reforms, implemented imperial record-keeping for the postal system. Tablets recovered from Persepolis show detailed logs, delivery times, messenger identities, horse usage, food provisions per station. These were not just messages, they were data points. The Persians were building a network that was as much about information control as logistics. Roads beyond the royal. Though the royal road was the most famous, it was only the main artery. By the late Achaemenid period, the Persians maintained a web of roads crisscrossing the empire. From Ecbatana in the highlands, to Babylon and the low Mesopotamian plain, to Persepolis deep in the Zagros mountains, even to the Indus Valley, where riders connected with Indian rulers. These roads allowed not just message movement but the movement of people, ideas, goods, and taxes. And the postal system helped stitch it all together, creating a sense of imperial unity across thousands of miles. Why it's often forgotten. Despite its brilliance, the Persian postal system receives less attention than Roman roads or Chinese courier services. Why? Few architectural remains survive. Most stations were simple and remote. The system wasn't open to the public, unlike Roman posts that evolved into civilian routes. It was eventually dismantled by Alexander the Great, who conquered Persia and implemented his own military courier system. Later empires borrowed from it, but didn't preserve its records or name. Yet its impact was profound. Rome noticed it. Greece admired it. China developed parallel systems. And in many ways, it was the first time a government weaponized information flow at scale. A legacy in silence. We rarely think of infrastructure as history. But Persia's empire didn't move by chariot or sword alone. It moved by message. By dust-covered riders who said little, stopped nowhere, and delivered orders that built and unbuilt cities. They didn't speak. They didn't delay. They just moved. And in doing so, they created the blueprint for every postal service that followed. But that leaves us with an interesting question. When the rider carries the message of a king, where does the power really lie, in the message, or the one who moves it? In the dim offices of Persepolis, a clerk presses a small seal into a damp clay tablet. He places it into a leather pouch and hands it to a mounted courier. The man nods once without a word and sets off into the early dawn. He'll ride hard, but he won't reach his final destination. Not because of failure, because of design. The Persian courier system wasn't about one man crossing vast distances. It was about relays, coordination, and an empire that knew how to move information better than any before it. And in this section, we explore how this quiet, dusty infrastructure enabled the Achaemenid Empire to rule over vast territories, suppress rebellions, collect taxes, and even deliver punishments across continents, all without raising its voice. Because when you can send a message faster than a revolt can spread, you don't always need a sword. Satrapies and the need for rapid communication. The Achaemenid Empire was divided into administrative regions called satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by a satrap, a sort of royal governor who wielded considerable local power, but remained subordinate to the great king in Susa, Persepolis, or Ecbatana. By the time of Darius I, there were over 20 satrapies, each with its own capital city, taxation system, military garrisons, local languages and customs. It was a structure that enabled flexibility, but also demanded a strong central hand. How did the king ensure obedience? How did he verify the loyalty of a satrap hundreds of miles away? He wrote, and his messages rode. What did the couriers carry? Most messages were sealed tablets, either baked clay or papyrus scrolls encased in leather, bearing the mark of the king or his officials. These messages included tax demands, specific quotas of grain, silver, or military service; census data, headcounts and land use reports; judicial decisions, verdicts in legal disputes from the central court; administrative orders, edicts about building projects, boundary changes, or trade permissions; military commands, mobilizations, troop movements, or reinforcements. Many of these records survive in fragments from Persepolis, where a cache of over 20,000 clay tablets was unearthed, known today as the Persepolis Fortification Archive. The tone of the messages was consistent, precise, efficient, bureaucratic. This was not literature. It was logistics. Surveillance by speed. Fast messaging allowed the Persian king to practice what modern historians might call soft surveillance. Here how it worked. Satraps were required to submit regular reports on agriculture, trade, justice, and local unrest. Couriers delivered these to central offices, where scribes recorded them. In cases of suspicion, inspectors were dispatched, often traveling the same courier routes. If corruption or rebellion was suspected, arrest orders or military responses could be sent before matters escalated. It created an empire that didn't need to place soldiers on every street, because it could place eyes on every province instead. As one historian put it, the Persians didn't govern with omnipresence. They governed with omnireach. The message was the empire. Communication wasn't just how the empire functioned, it was what held it together. To rule over a territory that spanned over 5 million square kilometers, the Achaemenids didn't need a massive standing army in every satrapy. They needed awareness, responsiveness, standardization. The postal network ensured that laws, customs, and royal decrees could arrive in identical form from Susa to Sardis, from Babylon to Bactria. This allowed uniform taxation policies, consistent currency usage, the darak and siglos, coordination of major infrastructure, roads, canals, temples. More than once, historians have referred to the Persian Empire as the first true information state. It wasn't just about conquest. It was about administration. The logistics behind the speed. Herodotus claimed that a royal courier could traverse the royal road Sardis to Susa in 7-9 days. That's nearly 250 kilometers per day. Is that possible? Let's break it down. Each courier rode only one leg, typically 25-30 km. At gallop or canter, a fresh horse can cover 25 km in about an hour. Riders didn't stop to sleep, eat, or water horses they swapped. Stations were ready 24/7. Horses were kept in rotation, rested and well fed. The speed came not from the rider but from the relay model, very similar to the Pony Express 2,000 years later. Modern simulations suggest Herodotus may not have exaggerated. The Persians achieved what was essentially a 24-hour airmail system by hoof. Cultural implications: a road as a mirror. The postal system also reflected Persian values. Order over chaos. The system was tightly scheduled and consistent. Silence over spectacle. Riders were anonymous, uncelebrated, disciplined. Control without presence. Power was projected by message, not necessarily by military presence. Unity across diversity. Messages were translated into Aramaic, Elamite, or Greek as needed, ensuring comprehension across cultures. This was not a showy empire. It was a quietly competent one. Legacy and later echoes. Though the Achaemenid system faded after Alexander the Great's conquest, c. 330 BCE, its influence endured. Later systems borrowed heavily from Persian logistics. The Roman cursus publicus was based on Persian chapar stations. The Mongol yam system revived the relay model in Central Asia. The Ottoman courier, routes across Anatolia built on ancient roadways. Even modern postal and military dispatch models use Persian principles: segmented delivery, relay systems, standardized stations. The Persians didn't just invent a courier system. They invented a concept: information as infrastructure. Final thoughts: the quiet power of boring things. There were no heroes in the Persian courier network. No speeches. No parades. No monuments. But through a system of clay tablets, leather pouches, and relay riders, the empire kept order. And perhaps that's the lesson. History isn't just made by battles or thrones. Sometimes it's made by a man on a horse, riding through the night, bringing a message from the king. Not for glory, just because that's what the system demanded. Which brings us to one final thought. If an empire can be run by couriers, what happens when the messages stop arriving? The last light of day stretches across the royal road. Another courier has passed another sealed message, now riding a fresh horse toward a distant satrapy. There are no fanfares, no trumpets, just hoofbeats. And that's how it always was. An empire spread across deserts, mountains, and rivers, held together not by the weight of armies, but by the rhythm of riders. This final section traces the decline, legacy, and symbolic power of Persia's ancient postal system, and explores what it means that a civilization once relied so heavily on a simple, repeatable act, carrying a message. Because while kings ruled from palaces, their true reach traveled on horseback. When roads fell silent, every great system reaches a moment when its silence says more than its function ever did. By the time Alexander the Great invaded Persia in the late 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid postal network was still running, but under strain. Internal rebellions had flared. Royal succession disputes had destabilized court control. The imperial bureaucracy, once efficient, became fractured. Even as Darius III attempted to organize resistance, it was clear the old system was faltering, not from military inferiority alone, but from loss of coherence. The roads remained. The station stood. But the central message had weakened. And when Alexander burned Persepolis, he didn't just destroy a city, he symbolically severed the source of the empire's communications. After that, the system unraveled. What survived? We know the Persian postal system existed thanks to several overlapping sources. Herodotus, who admired its speed and reliability. Xenophon, who praised its discipline. Cuneiform tablets from Persepolis, detailing payments, riders, and routes. Later Roman accounts, which adapted Persian systems to their own infrastructure. But what didn't survive? Detailed manuals or engineering records. The full map of way stations. The names of riders or inventors. A cultural memory beyond quiet admiration. In short, the system left no heroes, no monuments, only function. And perhaps that was its genius. The symbolism of the silent rider. There's something almost mythical about the image of the Persian courier. Riding without rest. Never speaking. Carrying not opinions but truths from the king. He was not a herald shouting news in the streets. He was not a soldier taking ground. He was a conduit, a channel through which authority moved, shaped, and reasserted itself. In many ways, the Persian courier was an early form of what we now call infrastructure as identity. The rider didn't just serve the state. The rider was the state. Without the courier, the king could not see beyond his city walls. Without the roads, there was no reach. Influence across empires. The Achaemenid system set a precedent, one that echoed through history. Rome. The cursus publicus was a Roman adaptation of the Persian model. Established by Augustus, it used relay stations, messenger badges, diplomata, and official wagons. It too prioritized imperial communication, though it eventually opened to limited civilian use. Mongol Empire. The Yam system devised under Genghis Khan used relay stations, Ordu, and fast riders to connect Asia from the Caspian Sea to Korea. Messages could travel up to 200 miles per day. Like Persia's, the Mongol system was military, centralized, and ruthlessly efficient. Ottoman Empire. Ottoman courier routes connected Anatolia and the Middle East using roads and way stations similar in layout to Persian chaparkhane, often built upon the same ancient foundations. Modern state postal systems. Though civilian in purpose, the DNA of modern postal networks, USPS, Royal Mail, etc., can trace philosophical lineage to Persia. Centralized authority using decentralized speed to connect a population. In short, the Persians built the first communication infrastructure, intended to hold an empire together. Data before data. Though they didn't use our terminology, the Persians had developed a data distribution model centuries ahead of its time. Centralized origin Susa, Persepolis. Encoded transmission, sealed scrolls, tablets. Packet switching logic, relay handoffs. Confirmation of receipt, reverse couriers or inspection reports. This model parallels modern digital networks except their packets were handwritten, and their routers were men on horseback. It's a stark reminder that information control has always been central to governance. What changed wasn't the concept, just the medium, the message beyond the message. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Persian postal system is what it reveals about trust and expectation. The king trusted the system would function. The satrap trusted the message would arrive. The population understood that orders, judgments, and law came through the road. This trust was so fundamental that when the system faltered, the empire did too. Not from invasion, but from informational collapse. There's a lesson in that, especially for our time. In the modern age, the roads we don't see. Today, we live surrounded by unseen courier systems. Email servers, fiber optics, cloud message queues, data relays between continents. The world moves at the speed of the unseen, just like it did for Persia. But where Persian riders carried the will of one king, our systems carry millions of messages every second. The stakes are higher, the noise is louder. And yet the ancient problem remains. How do you maintain coherence in a world too large to govern face to face? Final reflection, legacy in silence. The Persian postal system isn't remembered with monuments or epics. It's remembered through its function, through what it enabled. It built no palaces. It won no wars. But it made both possible. Its story is one of silent motion, of discipline without applause, and of an empire that understood something we are still learning today. That control doesn't come from force, it comes from flow. So next time you open an inbox, or see a package on your doorstep, or watch a notification ping across your screen, pause and consider the forgotten rider, galloping into history, carrying only a message, and with it the weight of a world. Story 5. Chinese Civil Service Exams, Bureaucracy and Brilliance. The sun rises over an imperial testing compound. Its high walls loom like fortress battlements. Inside, rows upon rows of tiny cubicles stand in silence, cramped, open-roof stalls made of wood and stone. And in each one sits a man, dressed simply, head bent, writing. He will remain there for 3 days. He cannot leave. He will sleep where he writes, eat where he thinks, and answer not to a general or nobleman, but to a set of questions pulled from ancient texts. No weapons, no bribery, no lineage. Just ink, intellect, and endurance. This is the Keju, the Imperial Civil Service Examination of ancient China. It is perhaps the most enduring form of organized examination in human history, spanning over 1,300 years across multiple dynasties. And though it seems bureaucratic, perhaps even dull, it helped to define the structure of the Chinese state, the very idea of a merit-based government, the lives of millions across centuries. And it all began with a single premise: that a man's worth in government should be judged by his knowledge of books. The origins, from hand to sway. The idea of selecting officials based on merit dates to the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE. But the system wasn't formalized until much later. During Han times, local officials recommended candidates. Recommendations were often based on character, family background, or reputation. Exams existed, but were informal and inconsistent. It wasn't until the Sui dynasty, 581–618 CE, that a centralized examination system began to emerge. The Sui emperors, facing the need to consolidate power, sought educated officials who were not tied to powerful clans. Thus, exams were used to test knowledge of Confucian classics texts that emphasized hierarchy, morality, and good governance. By the time of the Tang Dynasty, 618–907, the system had become institutionalized. And in the Song Dynasty, 961–279, it became the primary method of recruitment into the state bureaucracy. What was on the exam? A civil service candidate had to be well versed in the Confucian canon, which included the 5 classics: Book of Songs, Book of Documents, Book of Rites, I Ching, and Spring and Autumn Annals. The 4 books added later: Analects, Mencius, Great Learning, Doctrine of the Mean. Candidates were tested on moral philosophy, historical knowledge, poetry composition, rhetorical essays, policy writing. The exams weren't just about regurgitation. They required memorization, but also interpretation, logical reasoning, and application to governance. One of the most infamous formats was the 8-legged essay, introduced later in the Ming, a rigid, structured response format with strict stylistic rules. Success required years, often decades, of study, mastery of calligraphy, knowledge of multiple texts and commentaries, mental and physical endurance. This wasn't education as personal enlightenment. It was education as survival. Life of a scholar, preparation, poverty, persistence. To even sit for the lowest level of the exam, a man typically had to begin studying as a child. Village schools offered basic instruction in classical Chinese and Confucian thought. Private tutors were hired by wealthier families. Memorization of the classics was essential. Many could recite thousands of lines by heart. Boys as young as 6 began preparing for an exam they might not pass until they were 30. The pressure was immense. Failure was common. Some men took the exam over a dozen times before passing. Entire families pinned their hopes on one son. Some even sold land or goods to fund his study. And for those in rural areas, the exam represented something rare. Social mobility. Pass the exam and you could become a government official, a landowner, even marry into a better family. But fail and you returned home, often humiliated. The exam halls, a quiet ordeal. Examinations were held at 3 main levels. Prefectural exams, local. Provincial exams, regional. Metropolitan exams in the capital. At each level, the exams became harder, the competition fiercer. The testing environment was isolating and grueling. Candidates were placed in small, windowless stalls, barely enough room to sit or lie down. Exams could last up to 3 days. Food was brought in. Bodily functions were handled in the stall. Cheating was punishable by death or permanent banishment. Before entering, scholars were searched for concealed materials. In later dynasties, even the calligraphy was copied by scribes to ensure anonymity during grading. This was not a test of brilliance alone. It was a test of obedience, endurance, and conformity to the values of the state. What did success bring? Passing any level of the exam brought status, but the highest honor was the jinchi degree, earned at the national level. Jinchi holders were appointed to high-ranking posts in the imperial bureaucracy, given stipends, housing, and land rights, immortalized in public records and ancestral tablets, often remembered as the pride of their hometown. Even low-level passes could lead to careers as clerks, teachers, or advisors. The system created a class of scholar officials known as the literati who wielded immense influence in Chinese society, shaping policy, culture, and moral standards. But there were costs too. The pressure to conform. While the exams were theoretically merit-based, they also enforced ideological orthodoxy. The state determined which texts mattered. Alternative philosophies, legalism, Taoism, Buddhism, were minimized or ignored. Creativity was often discouraged in favor of formulaic responses. This created an educated elite that was loyal to the system, but often resistant to innovation. Many scholars became experts in ancient texts, but struggled to adapt to new ideas or crises. In some dynasties, officials passed exams with flying colors, then failed disastrously at governance. Which begs a difficult question. Does passing a test mean you're prepared to lead? The civil service exam promised order, justice, and fairness. But it also created barriers, blind spots, and brittle thinking. It gave China a bureaucratic backbone that endured for centuries. But at what cost? If the system rewards memory over insight, what kind of leaders does it produce? In the stillness of a provincial exam hall, over 1,000 candidates sit in identical cells, scribbling under dim light. The air is thick not with sound, but with the weight of expectation. Outside, families wait for days, hopping for a glimpse of success. Inside, 1,000 futures balance on the edge of a brush. This is not war. It is not trade. It is not exploration. And yet, it is the center of the Chinese state. In this section, we explore the deep structures and cultural effects of the civil service exam system, the social roles it reinforced, the ideologies it preserved, and the quiet control it exerted over one of the most enduring civilizations on Earth. Because this wasn't just a test, it was the machine behind the mandate of heaven. Bureaucracy as philosophy. Confucianism wasn't simply tested in the exams, it was institutionalized through them. Candidates were required to study and recite Confucian texts, but more importantly, they had to demonstrate how those principles could be applied to real governance problems. Core Confucian values shaped how government was conceived. Hierarchy was natural and necessary. Filial piety extended into loyalty to the emperor. Virtue was more important than law. Stability was preferable to innovation. This created a system where bureaucrats were moral guardians, not just administrators. A qualified official was expected to serve with integrity, correct the emperor when necessary, ensure just application of policies, promote harmony over disruption. This ideal, while often unmet, created a bureaucratic class that saw itself as righteous, even when imperial politics grew corrupt. Graduation cap education as social engineering. The exam system was open in theory to all males, regardless of birth, but in practice, only elite and middle-class families could afford the necessary education and preparation. Over time, this produced a complex set of social effects. Houses 1. Multi-generational strategy. Families often groomed one son to pursue the exam track, pouring resources into tutors, books, and connections. Success brought honor, jobs, and often land, lifting the entire family's status. Adult School 2. Expansion of schools. To meet the demand, state-run academies and private schools expanded across the empire. By the Song dynasty, education had become a social institution, a pipeline to power. 3. Social aspirations. Even poor rural families dreamed of raising a scholar. The image of the barefoot genius, passing the exam, was celebrated in folklore, though rarely realized. Balance 4. Gender and exclusion. Women were entirely excluded from the examination system. Female literacy remained limited and informal, creating a structural divide in who could participate in state and intellectual life. In this way, the exam system reinforced existing hierarchies while pretending to dismantle them. Abacus, the bureaucrat's career path. Passing the first-level exams qualified a man for minor clerical roles. Those who passed the provincial and metropolitan exams could expect appointments to county magistracies, supervision of grain stores, roads, and taxes, diplomatic posts, roles in the censorate, official government watchdogs. Promotion was theoretically based on merit, but also influenced by patronage, personal networks, and imperial favor. An official's performance was evaluated regularly, and failure could result in demotion, dismissal, or exile. Still, the pathway from student to scholar official became one of the most stable forms of career progression in pre-modern history. It was, in a sense, the original white-collar ladder. Person in lotus position, the weight of success. Ironically, passing the exams did not guarantee comfort. Many scholar officials were underpaid, assigned to remote or difficult posts, expected to self-finance basic administration, pressured to enforce unpopular taxes or imperial decrees. Even worse, some found their ideals tested when confronting local corruption, natural disasters, famine or peasant revolts, court intrigue. The very Confucian texts they had studied emphasized moral governance, but reality was often messier. A successful official might rise in prestige, but he might also face moral compromise, isolation, or even execution if he offended the wrong superior. Success in the exam was a door. What lay beyond it was not always glory. Scroll literary culture and the scholar gentry. The exam system birthed an elite class of literati scholars who valued calligraphy, classical poetry, historical writing, artistic refinement. These officials often wrote poems to express political frustration, essays on ethics and governance, travel journals from remote assignments, diaries documenting inner struggle. Their writing survives in vast collections, providing historians with a window into the psychological life of bureaucracy. A successful candidate was not just a bureaucrat. He was a custodian of culture. This helped maintain a continuous intellectual tradition, even when dynasties fell. Of a system under strain. Over the centuries, the exam system underwent reforms but also criticism. By the late Ming and Qing dynasties, key problems had emerged. 1. Rigid conformity. The eight-legged essay format had stifled creativity. Answers became formulaic, emphasizing style over substance. Mantelpiece 2. Delays and corruption. Some exams were postponed for years. Bribery and nepotism began to erode trust in the system. 3. Disconnect from reality. While China faced new global threats, Western imperialism, internal rebellions, officials were still trained in ancient texts, not modern economics or diplomacy. 4. Social pressure and mental collapse. The stress of the exam system led to breakdowns, suicides, and a cultural obsession with failure anxiety. Some candidates studied their entire lives and never passed. The system, once praised for meritocracy, had begun to look like a labyrinth without exit. Brain final thoughts, the test that tested a civilization. It's easy to romanticize the civil service exams men of modest means rising through intellect, bureaucracy shaped by ethics, culture preserved through scholarship. But it's equally easy to see its dark mirror. A society driven by conformity. A government staffed by exam winners, not problem solvers. A culture more invested in remembering the past than preparing for the future. And yet, even in its contradictions, the system held. For over a millennium, it gave China something no other civilization had achieved at that scale. A bureaucratic state based on ideas. So we're left to wonder, when merit becomes measurable, does it also become mechanical? The final candidate steps out of the examination cell. His hair is disheveled, his brush worn down, his scrolls tightly sealed. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bell tolls and 1,000 pens fall still. For generations, this scene repeated in cities across imperial China silent, disciplined, exacting. And then one day it stopped. The imperial exam system, once the pride of Confucian governance, fell silent in the early 20th century. But its impact didn't disappear. It simply scattered into schools, civil institutions, and modern systems of merit and testing around the world. We trace the decline of the Chinese civil service exam, its enduring legacies, and what it tells us about how societies choose their leaders. Because sometimes, the way a civilization selects its officials tells you everything about what it values and fears. The decline of a dynasty and a system. By the 19th century, the Qing dynasty, 1644–1912, was struggling. China faced a combination of internal pressures and external shocks. Opium Wars, Taiping Rebellion, Western imperialism, unequal treaties and territorial concessions, technological stagnation. Yet the exam system continued unchanged, even as the world around it was being redrawn by industrialization, colonization, and modernization. The very strengths of the exam system, its stability, discipline, and structure, became weaknesses in an era of innovation and rapid change. Officials trained to quote Confucius and compose poetry were now being asked to manage railroads, negotiate with gunboats, and reform currency. It did not go well. Stop sign final reforms and final examinations. In the late 1800s, reformist scholars began proposing changes. Expand curriculum to include science, mathematics, and foreign languages. Introduce military and engineering academies. Allow Western-style universities to qualify candidates. But each reform attempt ran into resistance from conservative officials, powerful clans benefiting from the status quo, a deep cultural suspicion of Westernization. Then came the Boxer Rebellion, 1899–1901, a nationalist, anti-foreign uprising that further embarrassed the Qing court. In its aftermath, even traditionalists agreed that something had to change. Finally, in 1905, the imperial government abolished the examination system. After 1,300 years, the long arc of Confucian testing came to an end. DNA what survived. Though the exams themselves ended, their infrastructure, mindset, and influence remained. School 1. Bureaucratic meritocracy. Modern Chinese government, even under communist rule, retained the idea that state service should be earned through demonstrated ability, though party loyalty eventually replaced classical education as the main requirement. Graduation Cap 2. Educational intensity. China's modern Gaokao college entrance exam is one of the most competitive in the world. Families still structure life around test prep. Schools remain test-centric. The echoes of Keju are unmistakable. Black 3. Cultural prestige of scholars. To this day, education is highly valued in Chinese society, and academic success is deeply tied to personal and familial honor, an inheritance from centuries of exam culture. Brain 4. Global influence. The idea of merit-based government through exams influenced British colonial administration in India and beyond, French and German civil services, U.S. civil service reform in the late 19th century, e.g., Pendleton Act. Ironically, though the system was discarded at home, its philosophy of examination-based selection spread abroad. Package the burden of rote. As the exam system faded, critics began re-examining its flaws more openly. Overemphasis on memorization, suppression of creativity, reinforcement of rigid hierarchies, lack of practical or scientific knowledge, intellectual stagnation in a changing world. For centuries, the exams had trained men to look backward to quote the ancients, interpret the past, and imitate great minds. But modernity demanded something else: adaptation, innovation, and the ability to predict what hadn't happened yet. The exam system had, in many ways, created loyal curators of a world that no longer existed. Performing arts the human side, triumphs and tragedies. Behind the statistics and structures were millions of individual stories. The scholar who passed on his 10th attempt and died shortly after. The village boy who made it to the capital and changed his family's fate. The woman who disguised herself as a man to take the exam, rare but recorded. The poet official who became a critic of the very system that had elevated him. The families that starved, hoping their son's success would save them. Each scroll, each ink stroke, carried not just words but hope, fear, ambition, and endurance. And when the system ended, it left behind generations of stories not of emperors or wars, but of quiet, personal struggles for recognition. Person in lotus position final reflections, a test of time. The Chinese civil service examination system is both deeply inspiring and deeply cautionary. It showed what was possible: a government not ruled by birth or wealth, but by learning. A society that valued education so highly it institutionalized it. A belief that moral philosophy could inform real governance. But it also revealed what happens when a system fails to adapt, mistakes repetition for wisdom, trains people to succeed at tests but not at life. The system's greatest triumph was its longevity. Its greatest tragedy was how long it survived after it had stopped being useful. And yet its legacy endures in the libraries of Beijing, the test prep centers of Shanghai, the standardized tests of the West, and in the very idea that perhaps, just perhaps, a good leader should be someone who knows how to think. Story 6. The bread riots of the Byzantine Empire, grain, taxes, and imperial panic. The city glittered beneath the Byzantine sun, domes shining like polished bronze, streets echoing with the hum of trade and prayer. In Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, it was said that God lived nearer to man. Hagia Sophia rose like a mountain of stone and light. But below its golden ceilings, far from the imperial courts and basilicas, trouble was always simmering. Not in rebellion, not in conquest, but in something far more ordinary. Bread. In the Byzantine world, bread wasn't just food, it was life. It was tax. It was currency. And when it ran out, or when its price rose too high, it became the spark that could set the empire ablaze. This is the story of how grain shortages, bureaucratic failure, and urban desperation led to violent bread riots in one of history's greatest cities. It's a tale not of heroes or generals, but of bakers, bureaucrats, and mobs. And it begins with a promise that the people of Constantinople would never go hungry. Classical bread and the Byzantine state. From the time of Emperor Constantine, 4th century CE, the Eastern Roman Empire inherited and expanded upon the Roman tradition of grain doles free or subsidized bread distributed to urban citizens. Why? Because keeping Constantinople fed was essential for several reasons. The city had a population between 300,000 and 500,000 at its height. It had limited farmland within its walls. It relied heavily on imports from Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. Bread was the core caloric intake for the working class. Grain was stored in imperial granaries and distributed via public bakeries. It was baked into loaves called panis civilis and handed out or sold at fixed, subsidized prices. In short, bread was an arm of government, and every loaf was a political transaction. Receipt the bureaucracy of baking. To maintain this system, the Byzantine state created a detailed, often rigid structure. Grain requisition from provinces, often paid in kind. Transportation by sea, primarily via the grain fleets from Egypt. Storage in massive granaries like the Horia Theodosiana. Distribution via bakers licensed and regulated by the state. Price controls fixed by imperial edicts to prevent speculation. The officials overseeing this system were known as the Praefectus Annani, grain prefect, a title carried over from Rome. Failure at any stage of this chain could mean spoiled grain, delayed deliveries, unpaid bakers, empty shelves. And empty shelves meant unrest. Balance the people and the price of grain. For the average Constantinopolitan, daily life revolved around the forum, the church, and the bread line. Bread riots were often not about starvation, but about expectation. The people believed the state owed them bread, and when it failed, anger turned political. Crowds gathered in the hippodrome to chant slogans. Clergy were petitioned to intervene. Streets erupted in vandalism and arson. Bread riots were often spontaneous, but they were also structured. People knew where to go, whom to blame, and how to pressure the state. In a city that prided itself on orthodoxy, order, and imperial majesty, the bakery was a powder keg. Fire the Riot of 489, a case study. One of the best documented early bread riots occurred in 489 CE, under the reign of Emperor Zeno. What happened? A series of bad harvests in Egypt and Syria led to grain shipment delays. The government responded by reducing the bread dole. At the same time, tax collectors continued to demand grain tributes from provinces. Urban citizens, already strained, gathered outside bakeries, only to find shelves empty. When the hippodrome races began, chants of "Give us bread" erupted alongside political jeers. Within hours, crowds stormed bakeries, burned grain carts, and attacked tax offices. The army was sent to restore order. Several rioters were crucified. Bakers were accused of hoarding. And the emperor was forced to issue an edict promising to double grain shipments the following month. What began as a logistical delay became a crisis of legitimacy. The people didn't just want bread. They wanted the system to work. Crossed bread as political weapon. In later centuries, emperors used grain supplies to manipulate the population. Justinian I 6th century increased grain doles to suppress dissent. Heraclius 7th century, during war with Persia, reduced the bread dole and faced mass protest. Emperors would often blame regional governors or corrupt officials, executing them publicly to appease the mob. But over time, the system strained under. Loss of Egypt to Arab conquests, 7th century, removing a key grain source. Decline in naval infrastructure. Provincial rebellions disrupting supply chains. And with each disruption, the people reacted not with patience, but with panic. The fear of hunger became a tool, used by both crowds and emperors alike. Baguette bred the hippodrome and the bread mob. The hippodrome, Constantinople's massive stadium, was more than a place for chariot races. It was a political theater. There, factions like the Blues and Greens gathered not just as sports fans, but as urban power blocks. They had patrons among the elite, ties to guilds and bakeries, influence over crowds and riots. Bread riots often began or ended here. A chant for more grain could quickly become a chant against the emperor. And emperors watching from the imperial box learned to fear the sound of panem, panem. Bread wasn't just food. It was currency of control. Bread, the quiet power of the baker. In the grand mosaic of Byzantine life, the baker seems humble, anonymous, flour-dusted, unnoticed. But collectively, bakers wielded enormous influence. Their guilds negotiated with the state. Their ovens were watched by spies to prevent underbaking or hoarding. They were required to stay open during holidays and riots alike. Failure to comply could result in whipping, fines, or even exile. But when they united or when grain ran out, their silence could bring the city to its knees. One chronicler noted, "The baker need not raise a sword. His empty shelf is revolution enough." By the end of the 8th century, as the empire shrank and centralized control frayed, the bread dole gradually disappeared. But the memory remained. The people never forgot that once the empire had promised them bread. And bread, boring, bland, everyday bread, had once overthrown emperors. Why do we build our cities on expectations we cannot always feed? Imagine a city where every loaf of bread is the result of imperial mathematics, where ovens are bound by law, where flour and rebellion travel the same roads. In Constantinople, bread was never just bread. It was the final product of a long, fragile chain, each link pulled taut by taxes, tribute, tariffs, and time. And when one link broke, the people rioted. This section focuses on the hidden machinery behind the bread supply, the administrators, policies, and pressures that shaped the Byzantine food economy. Because before the mob surged, someone miscalculated. And the empire never liked to admit its math was wrong. Receipt taxation in grain, the foundation. Most of the grain that fed Constantinople didn't arrive through trade, it came through taxation in kind. Rather than collecting coins, the empire demanded grain, oil, wine, livestock from provinces as imperial tribute. This served several purposes. Avoided monetary inflation, provided for both military and civil needs, created a redistribution economy where food flowed from rural farms to urban mouths. But this system was vulnerable to whether droughts or floods ruined harvests. Rebellion, warlords or governors could withhold tribute. Logistics, poor roads or delayed fleets led to spoilage. Corruption, officials might skim supplies for personal gain. And because grain taxes were fixed long in advance, local suffering was often invisible to imperial planners. If a province couldn't pay, it was punished. If the city couldn't eat, it revolted. Amphora granaries and the supply chain. Once grain was collected, it needed to move quickly and efficiently. Stored in vast urban horia, granaries. Carried overland on carts and mules. Shipped across the Aegean and Mediterranean on grain fleets. Protected by imperial patrols from pirates and storms. Timing was everything. If ships arrived late, grain could rot or ferment in humid warehouses. Granaries were state-controlled and guarded. They were often located near city gates, adjacent to ports, in heavily policed districts. During shortages, they became targets for looting. During riots, they burned. One imperial edict from the 6th century demanded that all bakers and their ovens be within 1 mile of the granaries, and that no loaf be delayed once grain has passed the scales. In other words, grain was to be baked fast and watched closely, because even a day's delay could spark unrest. Classical the bread bureaucracy. The machinery of Byzantine bread was vast and extraordinarily detailed. Key players included Scroll 1, the Praefectus Annani. Originally a Roman title, this official oversaw grain collection, quotas, and pricing. Magnifying glass tilted left 2, commites and inspectors. Sub-officials tracked grain weights, monitored bakeries, and enforced bread quality standards. Adult cooking 3, bakers' guilds. Required to produce fixed numbers of loaves per day, paid in grain rations, not coin. Package 4, distributors. Handled the physical handoff of bread or grain to the people, often in public forums. Every stage included records, reports, seals, and checks. Miscounts were punished harshly. Hoarding could be considered treason. A baker could be exiled for using too little flour. An inspector could be beaten for approving underweight loaves. A bureaucrat who miscalculated shipments might face a mob at his door. In this system, failure was not abstract. It was personal, visible, and dangerous. Balance price controls and market tensions. The price of bread was set by imperial edict, a relic of the Roman edict on maximum prices from 301 CE. This meant bakers couldn't raise prices, even if flour was scarce. Officials couldn't acknowledge inflation without undermining state authority. Citizens expected the same price, no matter the season. The state occasionally issued grain subsidies to stabilize markets or mollify urban protests, but this often came too late. When prices fluctuated in the black market, wealthy citizens could afford grain. Poorer citizens went hungry. Tensions escalated. Price stability wasn't just economic policy, it was a social contract. And when that contract broke, so did public order. Stop sign scapegoats and crisis management. When shortages or riots occurred, emperors rarely blamed the system. Instead, they blamed people. Local governors, who were accused of mismanaging grain. Ship captains, said to have lost cargo through carelessness. Bakers, suspected of hoarding. corrupt inspectors who took bribes or miscounted scales. Imperial reaction often followed a pattern: arrests in public trials, exile or execution of key officials, temporary increase in grain doles, imperial decree reaffirming justice and divine order. The aim was to restore confidence, not fix the problem. And sometimes that worked. But sometimes it didn't. Scroll the riot of 927 CE. Bureaucracy fails again. Under Emperor Romanos I Lecapenus, Constantinople once again descended into chaos. What happened? Grain ships from the Black Sea were delayed due to conflict with Bulgarians. A fire had recently destroyed one of the major city granaries. Local bakeries produced half rations and closed early. Rumors spread that the court was hoarding grain for the army. Thousands of citizens gathered outside Hagia Sophia to demand relief. When the emperor sent troops to disperse the crowd, they refused. Instead, the people stormed the mint, demanding that coins be used to purchase grain from merchants. The emperor relented, ordering grain released from military stores. He also exiled 3 senior officials. But the scars remained. The city had learned once again that imperial competence was not guaranteed. Bread bakers on the brink. Bakers, while essential, were often treated as disposable. They slept in their shops, were forbidden from relocating, could be drafted into emergency grain missions, were required to serve through war, plague, or famine. During shortages, they were the first accused. And yet without them, the entire system collapsed. They stood at the final gate between state promise and public rage. When their ovens went cold, emperors trembled. The last fire in the bakery has gone out. The crowd has dispersed for now. The streets of Constantinople are swept clean, but tension lingers like flour dust in the air. This section explores what happened after the riots, how emperors, institutions, and even theology evolved in response to a city whose greatest threat wasn't barbarians or blasphemers but hunger. In doing so, we'll see how a loaf of bread and its absence shaped everything from imperial power to urban identity, and why the slow collapse of the bread dole foretold the decline of Byzantine control over its people. The gradual dismantling of the bread system. By the 9th and 10th centuries, several long-term changes began to erode the foundations of the imperial grain system. World 1. Loss of grain provinces. Egypt, once the empire's breadbasket, was lost to Arab conquest in the 7th century. Syria followed. Anatolia, though fertile, faced increasing raids and internal disruptions. Ship 2. Naval decline. The merchant fleets that once transported grain across the Mediterranean were gradually replaced by private shipping less reliable and often uninterested in fixed state prices. Classical 3. Shift to coin-based economy. The economy slowly transitioned from barter and in-kind taxation to currency-based transactions, especially among elites. This weakened the central state's control over the bread supply. BRICS 4. Urban depopulation. Constantinople's population declined due to plague, war, and migration. A city that once needed 500,000 loaves a day now required fewer than half that. As a result, the imperial bread dole shrank, then disappeared altogether by the 12th century. Bread returned to the market, and with it, so did hunger for those without coin. Jigsaw social stratification and urban class tensions. The end of state-controlled bread brought unintended consequences. Fork hunger as a private problem. Once the state no longer guaranteed bread, the burden fell on charities, monasteries, and families. The poor became more reliant on the church and the goodwill of the wealthy. Chart decreasing collapse of price stability. With the end of subsidies came price fluctuations. Famine years grew more severe. Black markets flourished. Classical rise of merchant power. Merchants and private grain traders gained new political leverage. Some gained court influence, others were scapegoated in times of shortage. Over time, the bakery riots faded, but the deeper problem remained. Bread was no longer a right, it was a commodity. Fire the role of the church, feeding the flock. As the state withdrew from the bread business, the Orthodox Church stepped in. Monasteries began operating public kitchens. Bishops organized grain donations and lobbied for lower taxes on peasant farmers. The Eucharist itself, a symbolic sharing of bread, took on a new, more tangible meaning. Bread became not only spiritual but social, a marker of Christian charity, a quiet reminder that earthly hunger was still a form of suffering. Even in theological writing, metaphors of daily bread took on urgency in an empire that was failing to provide it. Crown political consequences, the fragility of legitimacy. Throughout Byzantine history, emperors ruled with a delicate balance of divine authority, military power, economic stability, popular support. Bread touched all four. When the bread system functioned, it reinforced the emperor's image as a shepherd of the people, a new Constantine. When it failed, it revealed the truth: the emperor was not infallible. Repeated food crises undermined faith in central administration, eroded loyalty among urban populations, encouraged rebellion in the provinces, empowered local elites to step into roles once held by the state. In other words, bread riots didn't just threaten public order, they eroded imperial mystique. And in Byzantium, image mattered as much as reality. Chart decreasing the fall of Constantinople and final hunger. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. Constantinople was sacked by Crusaders in 1204. The empire was fragmented into rival states. Grain shipments were taxed by hostile powers. The population dwindled, and the city relied on imports from Italian merchants, especially Venice and Genoa. In the final decades before 1453, famine was common. The imperial treasury was nearly empty. Chroniclers described a city where even priests begged for bread. When the Ottomans laid siege to Constantinople, defenders gathered what little grain remained. There was no bread riot that day. There was no bread. Only silence and then collapse. Brain legacy, bread as a mirror of empire. What can we learn from a system that collapsed under the weight of its own promises? The Byzantine bread dole teaches us that governments are judged by their ability to deliver basics, not just pageantry. Infrastructure, once broken, is hard to repair. Food is political, even when it's mundane. Stability is not just about armies or laws, but about daily life. Today, when we think of riots, we picture flames. But in Byzantium, a loaf of bread could be both a gift and a threat. And when it disappeared, so did emperors. Sheaf of rice. Final reflection: the politics of the ordinary. The Byzantine bread riots were never just about grain. They were about expectation, about the space between what the state said it would provide and what it actually could. In the end, the empire that built Hagia Sophia, that preserved Roman law, that bridged East and West, was still undone, in part, by flour, fire, and fear. And perhaps the most haunting question they leave us with is this: what else in history began to crumble not with a war, but with a missing meal?